Death of the 14th century, to the Spanish flu of 1918, to the SARS epidemic of the 21st century. Outbreaks of virulent diseases have devastated entire societies.
Many civilizations came close to being destroyed by the importation of Western diseases.
Now, health officials fear we may be on the verge of another epidemic.
We don't know when it's coming. It may be pandemic influenza, it may be something else.
And one scientist believes that the culprit may come from outer space.
There's no question that a comet-borne pandemic will occur at some point in the future.
And we may have no defense against these extraterrestrial diseases.
That's probably the doomsday scenario that we should worry about most.
The result could be catastrophic.
A tragedy of unimaginable proportions.
Alien infection on Mega Disasters. Microscopic germs hidden from the naked eye. Throughout history, these mysterious invaders have wreaked havoc on mankind with devastating outbreaks of disease. The best minds of science have searched for the origins of these epidemics. Now, a respected astrobiologist suggests that some of the worst pandemics may have come from outer space.
I think every new epidemic disease had come from space originally at one point in time.
If this controversial theory is correct, it could help solve the mystery of the origins of some of the deadliest epidemics in history. For thousands of years, people had no idea what caused diseases and how they were spread. Then, in the mid-19th century, scientists discovered that some diseases were caused by microbes called bacteria. 50 years later, scientists discovered even smaller disease-causing agents called viruses.
It wasn't until the 1920s, 30s, or 40s that we had devices like electron microscopes that would allow us to see these very tiny viruses, visualize them, and figure out a little bit about them.
Although the origins of some diseases have remained a mystery, science has been able to answer many of the questions about how germs are transmitted. Throughout history, diseases were often spread by travelers.
As long as people have been traveling, so too have the germs that reside in those beings.
For thousands of years, geographic barriers such as oceans, deserts, and mountains provided some protection. But these natural defenses were broken when technological innovations enabled humans to travel the planet. In 1492, Christopher Columbus became one of the first to breach this barrier when he sailed from Spain to what we now call the Bahamas. When Columbus returned to Europe, his king and queen celebrated his triumph. What no one realized was that he and his crew had brought back a deadly microbe. The bacteria they carried was called syphilis, an infection that is transmitted through sexual contact and attacks the nervous system and destroys the brain. For the next 5 centuries, syphilis ravaged Europe. Invariably, germs have proven to be more virulent when first introduced to a new population. Doctors of infectious disease call the phenomenon viral naivety.
These particular communities had never had any experience with that bacteria or virus, and so they had a much greater immunological response. It was much more devastating than if they had built up some antibodies, some immune response to those germs.
In many cases, once a person has had a disease and survived, he will not be infected again.
The human body's immune system remembers the foreign invaders that try to attack it, and sometimes its immune response is brilliant.
In 1519, the conquistadors carried a contagious disease called smallpox to Mexico.
Contagious literally meant it was by touch. So smallpox is a contagious disease because if you have an open sore and then you touch somebody else with that open sore, they have a high likelihood of contracting that disease.
It was smallpox more than the Spaniards' swords that devastated the native population. 200 years later, Captain James Cook crossed the South Pacific and left a trail of death in his wake.
These were peoples that had been living in island situations where they were cut off from contact with the outside world. Many of these civilizations came close to being destroyed by the importation of Western diseases.
By the 19th century, Americans living in port cities feared the waves of immigrants coming into their midst. Ships from Eastern Europe often arrived with many of their passengers already dead.
East European Jewish immigrants were called socially undesirable immigrants, as were Southern Italians and Chinese and Balkan immigrants and many others.
In 1892, President Benjamin Harrison halted all immigration when back-to-back epidemics of cholera and typhus caused a panic.
Typhus fever is called a filth disease because it's associated with filthy living conditions. It's actually borne by lice, and when they bite a human being, the human being gets typhus fever, which is marked by terrible fevers. You're quite insane. The fever is so high, and a body rash and seizures, and ultimately for about 25 to 35% of those who get it, death.
In 1918, the world was in the midst of a war on a scale never before seen. Out of the carnage rose a deadly virus.
You cannot separate World War I from the 1918 pandemic. They are intimate partners.
It should be remembered that this was the most fatal epidemic in all of human history.
People called the 1918 influenza the Spanish Lady, believing it had started in Spain. But even today, no one knows where the pandemic originated.
And a day before air travel, this appeared almost every place in the world simultaneously.
We now know that this global pandemic may have killed up to 100 million people. Witnesses described the course of the illness as shocking. Victims' lungs hemorrhaged, filling with blood. In many cases, death occurred in a matter of hours. Authorities were soon forced to quarantine the victims.
There were closure of sporting events, of films, of vaudeville, theater, saloons where people congregated. And when you think about a disease like influenza, that is primarily transmitted by the spread of respiratory droplets or aerosolized respiratory particles, so coughing, sneezing, things like that. The idea of separating the sick from the healthy actually makes a bit of sense.
So many Americans died that bodies were stacked in the streets like cords of wood. In some towns, people buried corpses in mass graves. But no one knew what had caused the epidemic. Today, many experts fear another global pandemic. Some even suggest that the next devastating scourge may come from outer space. Science has made enormous progress in understanding the transmission of germs, and yet the best minds have been unable to answer one basic question: where do diseases originate? In answer to this question, Chandra Wickremesinghe, the director of the Cardiff Center for Astrobiology, has advanced a controversial new theory. He believes that some of mankind's deadliest pandemics have emanated not from Earth, but from outer space. Chandra's work began over 3 decades ago in conjunction with the late astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle. They investigated the possibility that life is not confined to Earth.
Life is indeed a truly cosmic phenomenon, that it's not an earthbound thing, that we are part of a connected chain of being that goes through the comets to the remotest parts of our universe.
This theory is known as panspermia, the hypothesis that life on Earth originated elsewhere in the universe.
There has to be an enormous range in the types of microorganisms that are around in the cosmos. We have interacted and we have in fact evolved from a subset of these microorganisms. We have to conclude that our genetic ancestors still lurk amongst the stars.
Chandra believes that the seeds of life were transported to Earth by comets 4 billion years ago.
We know that this was a time of intense comet bombardment. Both the Earth and the Moon were being pounded by comet impacts, and I think it is quite remarkable that the oldest evidence of life on the Earth coincides with this epoch of intense bombardment, suggesting very strongly that comets did bring the first life onto the Earth.
Comets are formed from material contained in the gigantic dust clouds of interstellar space.
There are about 100 billion such objects, each measuring about 10 kilometers across, surrounding the entire planetary system, entire solar system, at a distance about 1/3 of a light year.
In 2006, NASA's Stardust mission successfully collected comet dust, bringing astrobiologists one step closer to understanding what these comets are made of.
Comet dust contains carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, which are building blocks of life.
Few in the scientific establishment had expected comets to contain any organic material whatsoever. This preconception had influenced the kinds of experiments that were undertaken by the Stardust mission.
There was no question at the time of planning the Stardust mission to look for evidence of life, of microscopic living forms in the cometary dust. So the manner in which the stardust particles were collected essentially precludes the survival of any living particles.
In 2001, Chandra, in collaboration with the Indian Space Research Organization, launched a balloon into the upper stratosphere, 28 miles above the Earth, to collect samples of comet dust.
We found evidence of bacterial-type cells, clumps of them in fact, so there was evidence that the particles in the upper stratosphere, which we argue came from comets, have signs of life.
For Chandra, this was vindication of the theory of panspermia and the basis for a new explanation for the origin of some diseases.
Once you accept that life did not start here on the Earth, that it came from comets, then you've got to take seriously the possibility that even diseases and epidemics may be caused by the introduction of cometary microorganisms.
Chandra believes that some viruses could survive even the harshest conditions in space. The notion that disease-causing organisms come from space may explain the odd patterns of certain historical epidemics, including the influenza of 1918.
It's very different from any other influenza virus that's ever been seen in fundamental ways. Almost everything about it was a mystery. It appeared to come out of nowhere, and there was no precedent for it.
The first anomaly of the 1918 epidemic was that it simultaneously struck on distant continents.
The lethal wave of the 1918 pandemic started on the same day in Boston and Bombay, and this was way before air travel.
This wide dispersal of the virus undermines the possibility of person-to-person transmission. Although infectious diseases like influenza follow a rapid trajectory, this was too fast. The second mystery of the 1918 flu was the pattern of death among people within a specific age range.
Why was it so fatal, disproportionately fatal to healthy young adults who almost never are at high risk of dying from flu?
The explanation given by epidemiologists is that during the war years, many young men fought together in the trenches or were sequestered in army bases. Crowded barracks were the perfect breeding ground for the virus. But Chandra speculates that the vulnerability of people in their 20s and 30s was caused by an entirely different factor. Since this age group was more active and more likely to move about in the open air, they were more likely to be exposed to the airborne virus.
We've got to understand why it spread so rapidly in 1918, and the clear answer is that it fell from the skies.
Population density seemed to have no bearing on the way the disease moved across the wide open spaces of Alaska. In 1918, fewer than 50,000 people lived in Alaska, an area the size of Europe.
The influenza spread like wildfire instantly across that whole area once it got started.
In some Eskimo villages, up to 90% of the population died. Doctors of infectious disease say this is a perfect example of viral naivety, in which a population without immunity is more vulnerable to a disease. Still, this does not explain how the epidemic jumped from one isolated village to another.
They have to use the most tedious ways to go from one end of Alaska to another, and the person-to-person contact is just impossible in those situations.
Since the virus vanished in the spring of 1919, it has remained a mystery. A mystery that has lured several scientists to search for answers preserved in ice. Fearing a similar pandemic could strike soon, experts are in a race against time. If they unlock the virus's genetic code, they could save millions of lives. Could the influenza epidemic of 1918 have originated in outer space? The flu of 1918 was like no influenza ever seen before. Like a biblical plague, it ravaged the world. In the U.S., influenza appeared in September, and within 3 months, 500,000 Americans lay dead. Doctors were desperate to know where it came from and how it was transmitted. Most important, could it happen again? Decades later, scientists had not unlocked any of its secrets. Then, in 1951, a pathologist named Johan Halton set out to solve this mystery. Knowing that heat is the enemy of viruses, Halton reasoned that if the flu were to be preserved anywhere, it would be in the ice of the Great White North. His idea was to retrieve lung tissue from long-dead flu victims buried in the permafrost.
But the thought was, because viruses can be preserved in low-temperature freezers and other cold sources for long periods of time, that if these people had died with virus in them, that virus might be frozen and preserved in the way it would be in a freezer and then recoverable.
Halton learned that 72 of the 80 residents living in the village of Brevig had died from the flu during the month of November 1918.
There were small villages in Alaska where the rate of death was very high, and nobody really knows why.
He exhumed several corpses from a mass grave site sunk deep in the frozen tundra. Halton tried to culture the virus, but he never succeeded. The technology at the time was limited. 44 years later, in 1995, a molecular pathologist named Dr. Jeffrey Taubenberger decided to try again. If he could sequence the virus, he might be able to make a protective vaccine. This time, Taubenberger had at his disposal a revolutionary new technique called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction.
Polymerase chain reaction. And it's a fancy scientific word for a technique in which small amounts of nucleic acid, which can't otherwise be detected, can be amplified so that instead of being X number of copies, there are 10X and 100X and 1,000X and 1,000,000X copies.
When the nucleic acid is replicated, it goes from being undetectable to detectable. Once it's detectable, the sequence can be determined. Using PCR, Taubenberger analyzed lung tissue that had been fixed in formalin and stored in the tissue repository of the Armed Services Institute of Pathology. The shattered genes of the virus were so fragile, it took 10 years to sequence its RNA. Taubenberger was able to confirm that the 1918 flu virus had originated with birds.
That's not a surprise because we've never seen a human influenza virus that hasn't ultimately come from birds.
But the mystery deepened.
It's not like any bird virus we've ever seen before.
The 1918 flu seems to have caused what doctors refer to as an immunological storm.
What looks to have happened in these young men and women is that their immune system was on such overdrive that it flooded their lungs with fluid, chemicals, chemotaxins, macrophages, various components of the immune system, and it did too good of a job. It actually caused more damage than perhaps the virus itself.
Just as alarming, once the flu jumped species, it mutated, making it easy to transmit from person to person. It is this characteristic that sends shivers down the spines of epidemiologists.
If a virus or another flu virus were to learn those kind of tricks, and we had a pandemic of a very highly fatal virus, that's probably the doomsday scenario that we should worry about most.
No one knows how dangerous the next flu strain will be, but one scientist believes that the next pandemic is already lurking in the frozen material of space. Just as the 1918 flu was preserved in the ice of the Alaskan tundra, so too might alien viruses be preserved in the ice of comets.
Once they are deep frozen in a small particle of ice or material of any kind, they could last for an eternity.
Chandra believes there could be a pattern to the way comets deliver germs to Earth.
I think the most likely scenario is that for a comet to deposit in the stratosphere a pathogenic microorganism, a pathogenic virus, and for that virus to cause the new pandemic.
Chandra theorizes the SARS epidemic of 2003 is one such example. Experts now know SARS was caused by a virus that usually infects the respiratory or gastrointestinal tracts of mammals or birds, and was first identified in China.
We think it came from the ingestion of a civet, which is a cat-like creature. It's a great delicacy in Chinese culture. And as those people traveled to other parts of China, they potentially infected those people.
This was no surprise to epidemiologists. Asia is the epicenter of many viruses. The conventional reasoning behind this is that in Asia, people live in closer proximity to poultry and waterfowl. But Chandra has another more controversial theory.
The first points of descent of a virus that is injected into the upper stratosphere has to be eastwards of the Himalayas, because that is the highest mountain range on the planet that almost pokes a hole in the stratosphere, and small particles, virus-sized particles, introduced into the Earth's environment slightly eastward of the Himalayas.
If germs are dropping from space, it follows that birds would be the first recipients of a flu virus.
They sample the atmosphere more extensively than any other creature on our planet. They fly across hundreds of thousands of miles, and they inhale and exhale the virus.
But most astrobiologists stress that this is an unproven theory.
Well, there's no direct evidence that cometary dust has been responsible for epidemics on the Earth.
However, the genome revolution has positioned scientists to either prove or disprove the notion that comet dust is full of pathogens.
But we do have samples of a comet now just brought back by the Stardust mission, and so there's a way to test this idea that there are organisms on comets.
Coincidentally, the same technique used to sequence the 1918 flu, PCR or polymerase chain reaction, could be used to detect any microbial life present in comet dust.
Every time you sort of heat and cool a sample, you can double the amount of DNA in it. And that is the method of choice for prospecting for microbes on Earth.
In fact, PCR is such a sensitive life detector, scientists have used it to discover microorganisms in places where no one ever dreamed of finding life.
Habitats like boiling hot springs, or frozen wastelands in Antarctica, or acid runoff with pHs of 1, even organisms that can live in high doses of radiation, bacteria that can live on nuclear fuel rods in cooling ponds.
Astrobiologists are interested in hunting for microbes in space, where conditions are even more extreme.
Obviously, space is a challenging environment to live. There's no liquid water, it's a vacuum, there are no nutrients or few nutrients.
In the quest to discover extraterrestrial life, plans are in the works to construct a remote PCR test that can be performed on samples taken from the surface of Mars.
We are trying to build a DNA detector to send to Mars, and it's very much based on what we know about life on Earth.
In this case, the spacecraft and the samples would remain on Mars. Using PCR analysis, geneticists will attempt to find alien microbes by testing for the universal genes that define life as we know it here on Earth. To date, they have identified 500 of these core genes.
You can ask, of those 500 genes, what's the one or two genes that have changed the least? These are the genes that you can use as hooks to look for other organisms.
It's possible that some of these alien microorganisms we may find may be pathogenic. Without thorough testing, we will never know. Some experts believe that it makes more sense to test for Martian life by bringing samples back to a laboratory here on Earth.
We'll be looking for indications of active life. We would look for fossils. We would look for spores or dormant states. We'll even look for biomaterials, remnants of cell walls or whatever. So we'll look for any and all things that might be associated with life.
However, the mission would not be without risks.
And the only hazard of real concern to us in terms of the globe is a replicating organism of some sort.
Experts agree the chances are remote that Martian germs could escape and devastate the planet. NASA has put safeguards in place to quarantine a real-life Andromeda strain. But will they be sufficient? If an alien infection from outer space were to strike Earth, health officials might look to the lessons of the past for help. History has taught us that epidemics have a life of their own. The challenge today is how to detect and isolate disease-causing agents before they spread.
Each disease has its own timetable, its own tempo, its own mode of infection, its own serial interval, its own infectivity, and all that is taken into account by public health officials.
The first step taken by doctors when a new disease is suspected is to understand how it is transmitted. Is it transmitted in the food or water? Is it transmitted by coughing on people? Is it transmitted by sexual activity? Because if you understand that transmission, you could potentially block it. Public health officials know that once a disease spreads beyond control, panic may set in, and friends turn against friends. Family members may shun their own kin. This was true during the polio epidemic of the 1930s and 40s. It was not unusual for small towns to close themselves off from the outside world. Public gathering places like schools, swimming pools, and amusement parks were shut down. And we may face another global flu pandemic within our lifetime.
We need to be prepared for the next threat, and we don't know when it's coming. It may be pandemic influenza, it may be something else.
In a time of crisis, doctors fully expect that many hospitals will reach surge capacity. Doctors and nurses will fall sick.
You could lose 30% of your healthcare workers so that your capacity in and of itself to take care of an incremental number has already shrunk.
Life-saving equipment will run out.
We would have to perhaps tap into what's called a strategic national stockpile of antiviral agents or even ventilators to support people.
As we saw with Hurricane Katrina, alternative care centers may be opened.
In the kind of pandemic that we're envisioning, we'd actually like to keep people away from the hospital. The hospital is a wonderful place to spread disease.
Experts say planning ahead is crucial.
You are not going to be thinking too clearly in the midst of a major crisis. And key people themselves may be very sick. And so you don't want to be making deep moral decisions without a context to make them. You'll be way too emotional at the time.
In order to staunch the spread of a possible epidemic, guidelines have been established in advance. Doctors are required to report any unusual spikes in infectious diseases to health authorities. If there is cause for alarm, health authorities will impose a partial quarantine.
That would be a series of actions whereby public gatherings would not occur, concerts would be canceled, for example, schools would close.
In recent years, cases of a bird flu called H5N1 have greatly alarmed epidemiologists. The fatality rate among those infected is staggering.
The H5N1 virus in Asia and other places has been killing over 50% of people.
They know this flu has jumped from birds to humans. In a few isolated cases, it may have been transmitted from one person to another. If this possibility increases our anxiety, what about an alien infection brought here by a returning spacecraft? The stuff of science fiction, perhaps, but experts treat the possibility very seriously. The notion that it is dangerous to move material from one planet to another has been a concern of many scientists involved with space exploration. Article 9 of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, signed by more than 90 nations, dictates that all countries will avoid harmful contamination of the Earth.
When we sent astronauts to the moon during the Apollo program, the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty were put to their first test. At the time the astronauts came back, they were quarantined, along with the rocks and samples that they brought back.
NASA continues to be concerned that a returning space probe could bring back an alien organism that would infect our biosphere.
What's the probability that that sample might have something in it that could be infectious or biohazardous to humans? It's very low, but not zero.
In the search for extraterrestrial life, NASA scientists have long considered the planet Mars the best nearby candidate. During the late 70s, after the Viking probe to Mars seemed to indicate there was no life on the red planet, the concern over bringing organisms back to Earth faded. However, some startling new discoveries have caused astrobiologists to question that verdict. In 2006, photos taken of the surface of Mars by the Global Surveyor showed the presence of newly formed gullies, not apparent only 6 years earlier. These formations indicate that liquid water could have flowed on Mars within the last decade. This discovery has increased the likelihood that there may be life on Mars.
On Earth, everywhere that we see water, we see life. So if one is trying to find life as we know how to recognize it, the best place to look is where the water is.
Now, after more than 30 years, NASA may be gearing up to launch a new mission to look for existing life on Mars.
The real important thing for science would be to bring back samples so we could throw a whole battery of tests and lots of scientific expertise at the debate and actually have the samples here on Earth.
In this case, a spacecraft will be sent to Mars to collect soil samples.
How the device would collect samples up there, how samples would be sealed up in something that is locked tight and could come all the way back to Earth without releasing its containment, that's something that has to be worked on.
The sample would consist of material scooped from the surface of Mars.
Would fit maybe in a coffee cup. It would be made up of some gases that were collected at the same time, dusts, small soil samples, as well as pebbles, little stones that have been drilled out.
This container may hold the first evidence of extraterrestrial life, a prospect that sets off alarm bells. Some fear it could contain microbes as dangerous to the human population as those that caused the 1918 flu.
If you move organisms from one place to another place, beyond where they would normally disperse, you can have surprising outcomes when the new populations interact with each other.
NASA's policy is to treat any sample as hazardous until proven otherwise. In the quest to return a Mars sample to Earth, NASA has anticipated just about everything that might go wrong.
Spaceflight is a risky business. Probably the biggest threat would be that it crashed and was exposed to the environment.
It looks like we have a no-shoot, sir. Vector 200, put it on your nose.
An accident is a very real possibility, as evidenced from the crash of the Genesis capsule in 2004. NASA engineers will safeguard against this possibility by building a craft that is designed to handle a hard landing. Even if the capsule crashes, the container that holds the Mars sample will remain intact.
The capsule would be picked up at that point and transported to a quarantine module and then to a receiving lab.
This facility would meet Biosafety Level 4 containment standards.
Biosafety Level 4 is the maximum containment used by Centers of Disease Control and others when handling the most virulent organisms on Earth. Not because we think that a virulent organism would be in the sample, but because we don't know, and in that uncertainty we want to take the conservative route, which means to treat it the strictest way you can until you know more. And we're at that point in history where, like Columbus, we have the technology, we are looking to a new world, it's off our planet, and we have lots of ideas, but they're backed up by science, and it just really opens the whole idea of life in this universe into a new dimension.
NASA has taken precautions to prevent alien organisms from reaching Earth in a returning space probe. But what if an alien infection should reach the Earth by another route? Some infectious disease experts subscribe to the theory that the 1918 flu epidemic came from outer space. If it is true, it could happen again. One day in the future, a real-life Andromeda strain could come to Earth. A global pandemic brought by a comet.
I think it's inevitable. There's no question that a comet-borne pandemic would occur at some point in the future.
The comet passes within 9 million miles of Earth and streaks by, depositing dust into our upper atmosphere.
There is a stellar-like head from which there are a couple of tails, long tails, streaming out. These long tails are essentially the evaporated material from the surface of the comet. The Earth's gravity pulls these particles to the surface.
The dust begins falling toward Earth. Ordinarily, the Earth's gravity pulls the dust down slowly. It can take decades for the particles to reach the Earth's surface. But every 11 years, the sun enters what astronomers call a sunspot cycle.
The sun is a very active star. On the surface, it is spewing out energetic particles, electrons, and magnetic fields are present in large quantity.
During a peak in sunspot activity, huge quantities of energetic particles are ejected from the sun's surface.
The charged particles lead to the production of very strong electric fields.
The electric field effect pulls the virus down to Earth very quickly, providing the final ingredient for a pandemic.
We seem to need the peak of sunspots plus the virus injection to trigger a flu pandemic.
Migrating birds inhale the dust, ingesting virus particles contained within the dust.
Avian reservoir of virus is very easily established from an external source.
The birds now carry a lethal virus in their digestive tracts. A few mutations, and the virus jumps species. The virus quickly spreads to cities across the globe. Among them, Washington, D.C. Several infected patients arrive in the emergency room of a local hospital. The waiting room is crowded, and they are forced to sit elbow to elbow with other patients. Someone sneezes. 85 million bacteria and 4,600 invisible viral particles explode into the air, hurling at a muzzle velocity of 152 feet per second. The particles travel up to a distance of 12 feet. They linger in the air for more than half an hour. During this time, each mucousy droplet spawns 19,000 colonies of bacteria. It's a biological mega-disaster in the making. Several of the patients complain of extreme fatigue and heaviness in their chests. Doctors order diagnostic tests. It seems like an ordinary flu. Then, one young man coughs up a stream of blood. A nurse notices that his feet are turning blue from lack of oxygen.
Somewhere along the way, there'll be a different pattern to the illness. The problem there is that by then, other people may have been infected.
The hospital notifies public health officials. Doctors can't agree on a diagnosis.
Many of these new emerging infections are easily missed. One, because they're not necessarily anticipating them, and two, they can masquerade like anything else.
By now, over 100 people have been exposed. These people, in turn, expose others. In a nearby office building, a public health surveillance agent watches a bank of monitors.
At a city level, an emergency department starts noticing a spike in the number of people with increased respiratory problems.
By now, the hospital administrator has heard even more alarming news. At Dulles Airport, a passenger arriving from Hong Kong has been carried off the plane dead. His clothes are splattered with dry blood. Autopsy results are pending, but the suspected killer is a variation of the H5N1 virus.
With a virus like the current so-called bird flu, the H5N1 virus in Asia, which has been killing over 50% of people, if that virus would become pandemic, it would be a tragedy of unimaginable proportions.
In other cities all over the country, the same terrifying scenario is playing out. Public health authorities follow the guidelines prepared for a Category 5 pandemic. Households with ill people are quarantined. Many commercial flights are grounded. Work hours are staggered to slow the flow of public transportation. Daycare centers and schools are closed. Public access to Washington's monuments is denied.
Well, unfortunately, pandemic influenza can disrupt all aspects of society in a very fundamental way. And projections are that in a worst-case scenario, there may be absentee rates of 30 to 40% from all businesses.
By now, patients are streaming into the local hospitals, which quickly fill to capacity.
Something this large and of this scale, we along with other elements of the city and state hope that many of the patients, in fact, will be diverted away from hospitals.
Doctors and nurses are falling sick. Emergency services are overwhelmed.
Bottom line is really massive epidemic. We will run out of respirators, not just in this region, but in the country.
Emergency room doctors do their best to evaluate patients.
In a disaster framework, the overriding philosophy that is used to decide who gets the resources is the greatest good for the greatest number.
Those who have the least likelihood of making it are denied precious resources.
You have to make these Solomonic decisions, which can be very, very hard.
In these cases, death is unavoidable. In spite of media attempts to allay people's fear, panic mounts. Patients who do not need respirators are diverted to an open-air sports stadium.
The Ravens football stadium, lots of flat, open space inside where all the concessions are. Very nice, very comfortable. There's good facilities, lots of bathrooms, lots of running water, and so forth. The bigger issue is the transference of bodies and remains of people to the city, state, or regional morgues.
Bodies are accumulating so quickly the morgues are filled to capacity. At local cemeteries, freshly dug graves multiply, but cannot keep up with the death toll. 3 weeks into the epidemic, Washington, D.C. is a ghost town. And Washington is not alone. Cities all over the country are grappling with what has become a biological catastrophe, affecting millions of lives. For now, this scenario is still fiction. But if it should happen, can science help us find a way to protect ourselves against this kind of epidemic?